Hey everybody, I'm Chad.
And I'm Leslie, and we are the co-founders of 1040 Connections, and we are an organization that we desire to spread hope with all of our partners to those areas of the world that have little access to the gospel of Jesus. We want everyone to have a chance to hear of Jesus, to experience Jesus, and then to multiply Jesus in their own local contexts.
If you're new to 1040 Connections, don't know who we are, welcome to the video. Hope you enjoy it. If you are some of our church partners or financial partners, prayer partners, we just want to say thank you so much for your ongoing prayers and finances to help us reach people who have never heard about Jesus and to give yourselves an inheritance among the nations, because like Psalm 2:8 says, ask of me and I'll give you the nations as an inheritance. And that's what you're doing. So thank you so much.
Yes. And you, like we, are on quarantine probably because of the global pandemic that's going around the world. And Chad and I have just been praying for you. And we want you to know we've prayed for our partners. We're praying for our international and national partners. And we just started thinking, is there anything as we go into the Easter weekend that we could give just as a gift, just to encourage you as you're spending a lot of time at home. And we started thinking about one of our favorite topics is something that we've learned about the Lord's Supper in the past several years. And so we just thought we would just take a few minutes, maybe about 20-25 minutes, to explain something that is very significant that took place when Jesus did his Last Supper.
So we're going to explain some parallels between the 4 cups in the covenant ceremony of the Passover with the 4 cups.
The 4 cups of the betrothal ceremony in the Hebrew understanding of marriage and betrothal.
So it's pretty fascinating.
Yes, and the topic really, I guess it was about 5 years ago, we were just reading in Revelation 19. It was talking about the wedding feast of the Lamb. And all of a sudden, we were like, this is like a wedding feast, as if it's the first feast of the wedding, like the marriage ceremony. And so we love to study and we love culture.
Okay, let's go look back at betrothal ceremonies.
Yeah, we need to really look at like the weddings of the Hebrew people. And we found out that there was something called betrothal in the Hebrew culture. And we realized as we were studying that, yes, we are the bride of Christ, but we have not had the wedding feast yet that is promised us in Revelation 19. In the Hebrew understanding, we really are in a betrothal period with Jesus at this time. And so as we began to study, I and Chad started finding some writings that talked about that in the betrothal ceremony, there were actually 4 cups in the betrothal ceremony, and Chad said, Leslie, there's 4 cups in the Passover ceremony.
I wonder, could there be an overlap there? Could there be some symbolism overlapping there?
And so that just kind of set us out on a lot of study, because the Lord's Supper has always, for some reason, even before we got married, has always just been a very significant symbol in our lives, and we loved it so much we did it at our wedding, actually.
So at our wedding, you always get this little bitty cracker and a little bitty cup of juice. We thought, or I thought, hey, this is my shot to get a big chunk of bread. And so when the bread came around, Leslie got this little tiny piece, and I got a big chunk of bread, and I started chewing and chewing and chewing.
And this was like only we were doing the Lord's Supper in our wedding ceremony. And because we just really wanted to capture that a marriage is about serving one another. And what greater example do we have than Jesus? And God, who is whole, became broken so that broken people could be made whole. So we wanted to do it in our wedding ceremony. We had this beautiful Turkish tea set that we were using, and the pastor handed us the bread, and I took that. And Chad, I'm telling you, the song that was being sung was probably a 4 or 5 minute song.
Thankfully, the song was very long, so I could chew it quite a long bit.
Well, then the juice came, and of course, I take this little sip of juice, and Chad takes his cup, and I'm telling you, he turns it and chugs a glass.
It was my one shot to have a big drink of the Lord's Supper. It was good.
So our kids watched the wedding video a few years ago, and we didn't say anything to them, and then they both were like, Dad, how big of a piece of bread did you get? You're still
How long are you going to chew? As long as it takes to chew it, get it down.
So at our wedding, we thought, let's do the Lord's Supper. But then as we've now been married for 22 years, we realized that the symbol of the Lord's Supper that we take from the Last Supper of Jesus, there was a lot more going on in that upper room with Jesus. And so this that we're trying to do with you right now is we're going to take the 4 cups of Passover, and we're going to compare them with the 4 cups of betrothal. And then we're going to look at some of Jesus's teachings of how not only he was the fulfillment of the Passover, but how his teachings point to this incredible relationship that God is offering ordinary people.
So if you're not familiar with the Passover story, basically in Exodus, The people of Israel were enslaved to the Egyptians, and so God saw their suffering, He saw their dilemma, and He said, that's enough. I'm going to rescue out of this bad situation. So He sent Moses the deliverer. And we'll read from Exodus chapter 6. This is where it actually comes from. Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 and 7. It says, "Therefore say to the Israelites," God speaking, "I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with a mighty act of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians." So this is the heritage that for 1,300 years the Jewish people celebrated the remembrance of exiting miraculously from the slavery of Egypt. Now, when Jesus came along, He infused that ceremony with His own understanding. So tonight, as we teach a little bit, I'm going to be talking about the Passover ceremony. Leslie's going to talk about the marriage ceremony and how those overlap. So first of all, as we look at the Exodus itself, in the Exodus, we know that the Exodus required the blood of lambs smeared on the wooden doorposts of the homes.
And we know that the cross, it required the blood of the Lamb, Jesus, who was the spotless Lamb.
The Exodus provided physical delivery from physical slaves into freedom.
And at the cross, Jesus is offering freedom from from the spiritual bondage that we have to sin, and is offering us freedom from that type of spiritual slavery.
The Exodus showed God's superiority over all the Egyptian deities, the god of the sun, the god of the river, the god of the Pharaoh, the god of the cow and the frog. All these different plagues showed God's superiority over the deities of Egypt.
And in the divine paradox, where Jesus is weak and meek and is dying on the cross, Jesus actually, He is crushing all of the deities, all of the principalities of the world.
And finally, we see that through the Exodus, God frees a nation from slavery.
But at the cross, Jesus frees the nations, Gentiles and Jews, into one nation, the people of God.
So for 1,300 years, the Hebrew people have been looking back and remembering the deliverance that God provided. Little did they know that Jesus was going to be the fulfillment and saying, don't just look back, look at me. And actually look forward to what's going to happen in the future.
And not just looking forward to what's going to happen in the future, but embrace this divine human marriage that Jesus is trying to present to ordinary believers. He is the only way every person in the world can truly be fulfilled. Now, when we began to study these things, we knew that there were different commentators, different theologians saying different things, but you have to just study to show yourself approved, but you also have to have humility. And so finally, when we were beginning to see, were there things that were going on at the Last Supper that was, Jesus actually was doing some betrothal ceremony things too, we went to a Messianic Jew and we said, this is what we're beginning to see. Are we way off, or are we getting something
Making
here?
things up out of our head? Who knows?
And he said, no, he said, that's actually what a lot of the Messianic Jews think, is that there was symbolism of betrothal ceremonies going on when Jesus was presenting the Last Supper at the Passover, remembrance of the Passover. And so, as missiologists, we love to look at culture, but we like to learn from the people that the Hebrew people will always understand the Passover symbolism better than we will. But they also will be able to help us understand more of what Jesus might have been doing. So what we're going to do is Chad's going to explain the 4 cups from the Passover, I will from the betrothal, and then as we do this, just kind of go into a journey and see, what is Jesus inviting you into now, and how does this affect your life now? Because to me, that's always the question, is how do I apply it so that it makes a difference?
So when they would celebrate the Passover, the Jews would read Exodus 6, 6, and 7, and they would see 4 key passages, 4 key phrases that would each correlate with 1 cup of wine. So the first cup has a name. All 4 cups have a name. The first cup's name is the cup of sanctification. And it comes from Exodus 6, 6, which says, I will bring you out. I will bring you out. Now, bring out means to separate, to sanctify means to make holy, to become separate from, not to be mingled with everybody else, but He's going to bring them out from where they are. And this is the idea that of the physical setting apart of the Jewish people as God's people in the Old Testament. Now in the New Testament, Jesus wants his people also to be set apart. He wants his people, God's people, to be his family, his special people. And so when Jesus infuses the first cup of sanctification, he's inviting his disciples to be the family with him.
And in the betrothal ceremony of the Hebrew people, the cup one of the betrothal ceremony was actually also called the cup of sanctification. Now, in the Hebrew betrothal idea, what would happen is that the groom would know who he wanted to betroth, and he would travel, whether it was a block or across the town or across the city. He was willing to travel as far as it would take in order to get to the bride's house. Now, he would take this little trip with his family, and they would go to the bride's house. And then when they would get to the bride's house, the two families would drink the first cup before the meal, and they would talk about how two families were they to come together.
Separated out together.
Separated out altogether. So in the Hebrew understanding of marriage, it was a family affair. It was where two families were coming together to commit to serve one another and to humbly say that they would serve and accept one another. Now, Jesus invites the disciples in to have a Passover meal with him. It's like he's bringing two families together, saying, first of all, Jesus the groom comes from heaven and travels to the earth. You can just kind of see that symbolism. Nice. He comes a long way to get to us, to make himself a human and to relate to us. And then he talks about, in John chapter 13, he shows the activity of serving and what it looks like, and he washes the disciples' feet. And so in many ways, what he's doing is he's showing that in the betrothal ceremony, it was about how the two families would humbly accept and serve one another. Jesus is showing how two families can come together, God and his people, his redeemed people, and how we could serve one another.
Now, if you're reading the Gospels, you will not find anywhere that the disciples and Jesus drank the first cup. It's not mentioned. We can mark out which cup goes in which place because the meal happens right in the middle. 2 cups happen before the meal and 2 cups happen after the meal. And in Luke 22, verse 20, it talks about after the meal, they took this cup, which means the cup prior was cup number 2. And so now we'll discuss cup number 2. Cup number 2 is called the cup of deliverance or the cup of judgment. And this comes from Exodus 6:6 again, which says, I will deliver you from slavery. I will deliver you from slavery. And the Hebrew people drank this cup prior to the main meal. And of course, they were in physical slavery in the Old Testament in Egypt, and God brought them out of the physical slavery. In the New Testament, we celebrate that Jesus brings people out of spiritual slavery. We're enslaved to sin. Romans 6:18 says that we're slaves to sin, and because of Christ, we can now become slaves of righteousness. Basically, we're going to be a slave to something. We're going to obey something, either our flesh or the world or God's desires. And so let us be a slave to righteousness is the idea. So again, the second cup represents the cup of deliverance from slavery, from bondage into freedom.
In the Hebrew betrothal idea, the second cup that they would drink was called the cup of betrothal or the cup of dedication. And this was when the families would think through how the families could actually become friends. They would talk about the nitty-gritty parts of the contract. They'd talk about the bride price. They would talk about negotiate the different aspects of the of what it would mean, the cost that there would be, the bride's possessions, the issues of purity, the groom's ongoing support. They would talk about just all those different details. But the overarching idea was how the two families would become friends. Now, when the second cup would be taken, the bride and the groom, the future bride and groom, they would take the cup, and the fathers of both families would take the cup. It's interesting when you think about Jesus in the upper room discourse. He talks about in John chapter 15 about the vine and the branches, about connection. He talks about the importance of abiding together. He talks about his willingness to die for his friends. And remember in the cup 2, it was about the bride price. And Jesus is saying, look, and he actually says this in John 15, he says, what I'm telling you, you will not understand now, but someday you will understand. But he talks about the price he's going to pay for his friends. It's his very life. if you go on in chapter 15, after he's talked about the vine and the branches, he actually promises also about how he is persecuted, he will be persecuted, and he says, you will be persecuted also, because the master and the servant and all of those things. And it's really, when you think about it, it's kind of calling out that dedication that it's going to take the groom and it's going to take the bride in order to have this marriage that works. And so when you look at John chapter 15, you can see that Jesus is talking about this whole idea about being friends, and he's laying down his life for his friends. And that whole cup too is all about how two families are becoming friends and what it will look like to be dedicated to one another in true friendship. Amazing.
So we get to cup number 3. This is called the cup of redemption. And this comes from Exodus 6:6 again. It says, I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. Now, by this time, the family had eaten the meal. After the second cup, they took the main meal, and then they took up the third cup, the cup of redemption. Now, this is beautiful in that the outstretched arm of Jesus, just a few hours later, would truly be outstretched with nails in it as he gave his blood for the people in the room and for whoever's listening to the video right now. So this is the time when the redemption would actually take place, because God to the Egyptians was going to crush them as he redeemed out his people from slavery. And in this point, Jesus is saying, I am going to give it my all, and I am going to stretch out my arm for you.
That's beautiful. Okay, cup 3 in the betrothal ceremony, it was called the cup of redemption as well, or the cup of inheritance. And this cup was only drunk by the bride and the groom. And when they would drink this cup, it was to say that the contract was sealed. And now they were pledging themselves to be 100% faithful. So if you remember the story of Mary and Joseph, and they were betrothed, and then she finds out that she's pregnant, and he has in mind to divorce her. Well, they weren't even married yet. But in the Hebrew idea, they were married in the sense that they were betrothed to one another, and that demanded 100% faithfulness. Now, it's interesting when you understand this idea of the cup of inheritance, which is another thing they would call cup of redemption, cup of inheritance, because since they had not yet had the ceremony, yet if the groom died before the ceremony took place, the bride would inherit everything that came with that contract. And so that's how serious they were about 100% faithfulness on both sides. Now, it is interesting that in the Hebrew betrothal idea, that after they would make sure they had sealed the contract, they would drink the cup, they would set the cup down, and then the groom would leave. There would be a time of separation. Now, what would happen in that time of separation? The groom would leave and go back to his home, and he would begin to prepare a place for his bride.
That's beautiful.
It's incredible. Beautiful. What would the bride do? It's in the Hebrew understanding of betrothal, the bride would begin to prepare herself. She would get herself ready so that when the groom came back to get her, she was prepared and ready to go. So the groom is preparing the place. He's also preparing a feast. He's preparing for the wedding ceremony. And so it's in the separation, they are separated, but they're both doing something at that time. He's preparing a place. And then you see in John chapter 14, Jesus tells the disciples in the upper room discourse, he says, look, I am going away, and I am going away so that I can prepare a place for you. And because I'm going to prepare a place for you, I am going to come back and I am going to get you. And so you see this whole idea of what Jesus is laying out in this upper room discourse.
It's not just remembering backwards. It's actually projecting forward about what's going to happen in the days to come.
And it's also this idea of putting the cup of dedication. You have something to do in the waiting. You have something to do in the preparation. It's to be faithful, and it's to be preparing yourself for the groom who is going to come back.
Who said, this is my covenant in my blood given for you. So he personalizes it. Everything that they'd been doing for the past 1,300 years since the time of Moses, Jesus says, this is actually about us, about me and my blood for you. So it's not just remember back to Moses, remember back the death angel, remember back to the the Israelite people, ancestors? No, it's for right now and for the future going forward. So that's cup 3. Now we'll get to cup 4. Cup 4 is called the cup of protection. The cup of protection. And this comes from Exodus chapter 6, verse 7, which says, I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. Now, the Jewish people understood this verse to be representing becoming a whole nation on Mount Sinai. That's what they understood it. Interestingly, Jesus chose not to drink this cup. Perhaps he didn't drink other cups, but we know he did not drink this one because Matthew 26, verse 29 says he would not drink of the cup until he drinks it new with us in the Father's kingdom. So Jesus did not participate in drinking this cup. So even though maybe he didn't participate in the protection, maybe because he knew he was about to undergo the difficulty right here. Anyway, the cup of protection was cup number 4, and Jesus did not drink of it as they remembered about becoming a nation.
Cup number 4 in the Hebrew betrothal ceremony was called the cup of praise. Also, in the Hebrew betrothal, neither the bride or the groom would take this cup when they were setting up the betrothal contract. Remember, the separation has happened after cup 3. Now, what would happen after the separation is the groom would get everything ready. The feast was ready. The home for the bride was ready. So then the groom in the Hebrew wedding idea, they would come back. They would take their entourage back to the bride's house.
When she's made herself ready.
And the bride would be ready, and the bride's family and friends, they would join the groom's family, and they'd go back to the place that he had prepared for the bride. Then the wedding feast would begin, and it was a celebration that when they would drink this cup, it was the celebration that the betrothal period of time was finished, and now the marriage was beginning.
A lot of praise going on at that point.
A lot of praise going on. But it's interesting because when you look at Revelation chapter 19, that is the wedding feast. That is when the betrothal is finished, when the bride, when the groom, he has done his part. What does Jesus say on the cross? He says, it is finished. And then the bride in Revelation 19, what does she say when she gets up to the wedding feast? It says the bride has made herself ready. You just see betrothal all over this. She's
nice
made
parallels.
herself ready. And so then it's called the cup of praise. Well, what is going on all around this wedding feast? It talks about all the 24 elders and the creatures, they fall down, they're singing, Amen, hallelujah, praise our God.
A lot of praise going on there.
There's so much praise going on because the wedding feast can finally take place because the groom has done his part. He's prepared the place. The bride has done her part. She's made herself ready, and they're finally together. They can drink that 4th cup of celebration of praise together.
Jesus did not participate in the protection, and at that time he did not participate in the praise because he was looking forward to it with all of us.
Yes.
When Revelation 19 takes place. This is what he's looking forward to. So at this point, those are the 4 cups. And these are the 4 cups of betrothal, the 4 cups of the Passover, and these seem to line up in an amazing way. Now the question is, our bride, we are the bride, our groom has been faithful to us for thousands of years. Now, when Leslie and I got married, we met and married in 6 months. We were engaged in 4 months. And those days seemed to just go by so slowly as we anticipated the wedding day. Now, Jesus has been engaged, betrothed for thousands of years. He was faithful long before the engagement took place, and he'll be faithful all the way through. But my goodness, how long does a bridegroom have to wait for his bride to make herself ready?
And the reality is the bride is not ready. When you know that in Matthew 24:14, Jesus says that he will come back when the gospel of the kingdom has been preached to all ethnic groups.
And then the end will come.
Then the end will come. And there's still 2 billion people on the face of the earth that are waiting to hear the name of Jesus for the first time. There are people groups that are still not part of the body of Christ. And so for Chad and me, when we read the Bible, we believe this is a book that's not just to be thought through, it's actually a book to be obeyed. And so when we think about that Jesus is faithful to us, we then have to ask ourselves, then how do we become faithful to the groom? And so as we think about this, it's not in the sense of responsibility we must. It's in this incredible marriage, this relationship that we are with Jesus in order to accomplish the thing we share together, this passion that the world would know Jesus. When this passage was just so big in our lives, there was one verse, fine linen, bright and clean, was given for her to wear. So it's talking about that the bride has made herself ready. Fine linen, bright and clean, was given her to wear. Fine linen stands for the righteous acts of God's holy people. We're like, wow. So what God is doing, he's taking all the righteous things that everyone on the face of the earth is doing that knows Jesus, and he's weaving it together into
He remembers it.
He remembers it.
We remember him, he remembers us.
Everything.
How nice.
So the water wells you put in, the people that you feed, the face masks that you're making for people right now because of the pandemic, anything and everything you do. And so this partnership between Jesus and the church, it is a powerful partnership you've been invited into. It's not for the super saints, it's for the ordinary believers. And so that idea of partnership so challenged Chad and me that we wrote a book called Engaged in Love and War to talk about the partnership. And that's when as we were writing this, we found out about the betrothal ceremony and the idea of the cups. And so as we close today, we just want to encourage you, one, that you are so deeply loved. Jesus would not have died for you if he didn't deeply love you. He is sufficient for you, but he wants the whole world to know his name and know he's sufficient for them too. And so just please remember your incredible worth to God and that he was willing to give his life for you. And then in a love response to him, not because we must, but just in this overwhelming love response to Jesus, what a joy that we get to be the people that are bringing to Jesus the last remaining people groups so that he can be worshiped by a bride who has made herself ready.
And one last detail. The Lord's Supper, now, the Passover meal, looked backwards to the deliverance from Egypt. It foretold that Jesus would be the centerpiece of all of history. It projects forward to the day when we will all be completed and finished with the Great Commission and all gathered together to be married to Jesus. But it also, in 1 Corinthians 15, is a proclamation.
Yeah.
It's a proclamation to ourselves. We proclaim to ourselves how good Jesus is, but we proclaim to the nations.
Yeah.
We proclaim to the spiritual powers. We proclaim to the angelic forces or the demon forces, whoever it is. We proclaim the death and resurrection and burial of Jesus until he comes again. That's what 1 Corinthians 15 talks about. So the next time you celebrate the Lord's Supper, look backward, look forward, look now, look outward, because God wants all these things to be wrapped up into this beautiful ceremony.
And if you lead the Lord's Supper in your home this Easter because you won't be going to a church building, how exciting is that? Gather your people together and say, each of us, we're going to each choose a nation to proclaim his death and resurrection over that nation, and choose, if you have 4 people in your family, choose 4 different nations. Proclaim his death and resurrection. And I'll tell you this, one of the most precious things you can do in your family is to serve one another the Lord's Supper. When you study the Church of China and the Church of Russia, do you know why the Church of China spread so much faster than the Church of Russia did during persecution?
Russia required baptism and Lord's Supper to be performed only by the clergy. China allowed Lord's Supper and baptism to be performed by whoever did the discipling.
And that's actually biblical, the way they were doing it in China. So this Easter, when you're at home alone with your family, enjoy it. Go back to the way that Jesus first proclaimed, the way the gospel would move out the fastest. It was through the homes and through influencing people and multiplying churches one after the other as disciples were made.
So get yourself a big glass of juice.
Yeah, you can get a bigger glass than you can get at the...
Get yourself a big piece of bread and enjoy as a family.
Yes, enjoy your Lord's Supper this year.
God bless.
God bless.